Many egg companies want you to think that their hens are roaming free and happy. But a lot of those cage-free hens are actually trapped inside a warehouse, like recess got canceled, forever. That's why Vital Farms works with family-run farms so hens can do hen things outside all year long. Every Vital Farms egg comes from a pasture-raised hen who enjoys a minimum of 108 square feet of roaming room while enjoying fresh air and sunshine. We bet you can taste the difference. Vital Farms, where honest food is raised.
I can still remember the exact moment when I realized that I had fallen in love with farming. It all started during California's dry lightning storm in August 2020. At 5 a.m., my dad and I sat at our kitchen counter, slack-jawed and silent, as countless strikes of lightning slammed into the forests and fields around us. Gale-force winds tore at the house, and our phones kept lighting up with texts from concerned neighbors. A week later, I was knee-deep in a bed of carrots. My phone blared its emergency alarm, letting me know that a fire had sprung up nearby. When I stood up, I saw 3 smoke clouds in the sky. Fire season had begun. It wasn't until that moment, when I had to evacuate, that I realized I had found a community like no other. It was a community held together by the sharing of knowledge, goods, and genuine care for the earth. The farmer I worked for would thank me with armfuls of kale, lettuce, and buckets of tomatoes for a day's work. She would give me advice about my own garden, which my mom built and my aunt and grandmother helped grow. Another farmer would send me home from work with bouquets of flowers that adorned every corner of our house all summer long. It was like being part of one big farming family, a family brought together by a shared love for the land. Small farmers, like the ones I grew up with, serve as the backbone of communities across the globe. From vegetables and fruits to honey, they provide the local flavors and goodness we depend upon finding at farmers markets, stores, and restaurants. But their way of life is under threat. I'm your host, Isabel Lee. Welcome to The Future of Farming, a podcast from Aussie Media in partnership with Vital Farms. In this season of The Future of X, we've talked about farming practices that heal the soil, dietary choices in the future of food, and the role data will play in the farming practices of tomorrow. In this, our final episode, we look at how big agriculture, known as Big Ag, will impact the farming industry and small farmers in particular. First, what exactly is big agriculture? Big Ag describes large-scale corporations involved in farming, makers of tractors, companies that sell seeds, and large-scale producers. It is often used when pointing to the power imbalance between large-scale corporations and small farmers. But before we get to that, let's look at some advantages Big Ag brings to the table. Industrial farms produce more than small farmers. This makes sense. They have more tools, more land, and more helping hands. The greater supply they bring to the economy feeds demand. With ample supply, we as consumers enjoy lower prices at the grocery store. Large-scale farms also drive innovation because they are always seeking to maximize productivity. This means better technology and faster adoption of it, leading to better processes. But what are the costs? To answer that, we look at land ownership both in America and across the world. As Big Ag grows, the land available for small farmers obviously shrinks.
The expansions of Big Ag in the continent tend to create conflicts over land, over natural resources, as well as living space with the small farmers and indigenous communities.
Kartini Simone is based in Indonesia. She works to support grain partners in Asia. A nutritionist who has worked in rural development, Kartini is involved with the peasant and rural youth movements in Indonesia. As Big Ag expands, it encroaches on these rural communities that have cared for the land for centuries.
That's why it's very dangerous as we see the situations that small farmers as well as indigenous communities are facing, because they are losing their land, their livelihood basically, because of the competition with the big ag.
I think the biggest problem that we have is what Katini has referred to, which is land grabs.
Susan Nakakwa is based in Kampala, the capital of Uganda. She works with grain partners across Africa on trade policy and issues like land grabs.
The African continent is home to about 33 million smallholder farmers. So with the advent of big agriculture and with the advent of the industrial agricultural system, we are seeing a loss of livelihoods for smallholder farmers.
The loss of livelihoods is the tip of the iceberg, and it comes with a host of other problems.
We say that agriculture is the backbone of our economies. The land grabs have extenuating problems that do come up once they start happening. People losing their livelihoods, people losing their homes, people losing biodiversity, and we are losing the seed systems that we knew as a continent. As a result, we will eventually start seeing traditional foods starting to disappear.
Foods disappearing? Yes. As Big Ag applies pressure to small farms, the smaller operations are often forced to start growing cash crops instead of traditional ones. Cash crops are grown for their commercial value, for their potential to bring big profits. Some cash crops include corn and wheat. For cultural foods and ancestral histories, this shift can spell disaster. Susan Nakakwa again.
The cultural foods that we know are starting to disappear. Let's talk about sugarcane, talking about oil palm, talking about vanilla, talking about crops that we do not call food crops. So it's making way for cash crops and commercializing the agricultural system to an extent that we didn't know or see before.
In both Africa and Indonesia, a rising popular cash crop is palm, which is used to make palm oil. Kartini Simone.
In Southeast Asia, where I live, like in Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as the Philippines, we are the world's biggest producers of oil palm. Indonesia and Malaysia combined produce over 90%, 85 to 90% of oil palm in the world. So that puts a lot of pressure because oil palm is now used in everything from food to non-food, cosmetics and all different products that you can find when you go shopping.
Small farmers feed the world. They produce more than half of the world's food. But cash crops are not always meant for consumption, as our guests mentioned. Cotton, for example, is a big cash crop. So in some areas, the adoption of cash crops by small farmers reduces the amount of food being grown locally. Susan Nakakwa.
Smallholder farmers do feed the world. 70% of the food that is consumed around the world is planted by smallholder farmers. If industrial agriculture is only producing about 30%, that means that they're not producing food. They are producing fuel.
So the shift to cash crops is creating a crisis for small farmer livelihoods and access to food. But what about the environment? Using more land for agriculture must have a knock-on effect. In fact, almost all of global deforestation, 80%, is linked to agricultural production. This is a problem. Forests are carbon sinks vital in the fight against global warming, where more carbon is absorbed than released. So think forests, soil, and the ocean. Losing carbon sinks means more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Deforestation has transformed the Amazon rainforest from a carbon sink into a carbon source. Its carbon emissions come mostly from fires, which are often lit to clear land for soy farming. Kartini Simone.
In our opinion, I think that is very problematic, because if you let Big Ag continues at the speed that they are doing right now, and the consequences is not just bad for the small farmers, but it is bad for people in general and for the environment, because we have to acknowledge that we are now living in a time of crisis, both the climate crisis and the health crisis, and big agriculture have been the culprit.
2021 has seen a decade-high peak of fires in the Amazon rainforest. These blazes are largely man-made. They clear land for cattle or for agriculture. So this problem is getting worse, not better. Big Ag is pushing small farmers into practices that are bad for food crops, the land, and their own livelihoods. But what impact does this all have on culture?
A lot goes into an honest day's work at Vital Farms. Their purpose is to bring ethically produced food to the table, and they believe that pasture-raising animals is the most humane and sustainable way to achieve that. That's why Vital Farms partners with nearly 200 family farms, helping them to rotate their pastures and do right by the land. Because helping the land helps the hens, which helps the eggs, which helps you. Vital Farms, where honest food is raised.
Agriculture has always been a part of the African American experience or the African experience in North America.
Dr. Veronica Womack is Executive Director of the Rural Studies Institute at Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. She focuses on rural issues and works with African American farmers on agricultural policy.
When you think about the agricultural knowledge, the innovation that came with the enslaved population to the states, well, to the colony at the time, agriculture has been the center of our experience here.
Womack sees farmers as land stewards and producers, but also as preservers of culture. They are the creators of community.
That farmer is a culture keeper in that community. That farmer has heritage and history that's vital to the vibrancy and survival of that community. The African American farmers that I have researched, they continue to be the culture keepers, the leaders of their communities. The land that they owned historically and today, in some ways, make them more independent in being able to be political leaders or be leaders within their community.
Womack points to the contribution by African American farmers and to how land is tied to democracy.
Land has always been the center of democratic processes here in this country. Land was a symbol of freedom and self-determination. So African Americans aspired and acquired land, and land allows you to be more independent.
Small farmers are often the heart of their communities. But how do we ensure that remains true?
When you support a farmer, whether he or she or they are black, white, or whatever, you're supporting more than just that person in a farming capacity. And that's important for people to recognize. A small farmer, a mid-sized farmer, is connected to a community, and they assist in the development and the sustainability of the community beyond just that farm. The role that that person is playing in the economic system as well as the democratic system is very important.
Womack says we need better agricultural policy, rules that explicitly protect small and medium-sized farmers, especially Black farmers.
When you look at agricultural policy, particularly since the 1930s, the policy tends to support larger operations. So when you think about the resources that are available, when we see resources, we see services and programs, that is formulated at the policy level. So if we're really interested in building strong, small, and mid-sized farmers, it's important for us to also look at agricultural policy and what we're focusing on in the policy. That's critical because your policy is then connected, of course, to the funding that will be available. That's connected to the research that will be performed, to the education that will be provided around farming, practices and everything. And so policy is at the core.
So what are some examples of regulations that can help?
The small farmers markets, opening up relationships between the farmer and schools and what's served at schools. All of that is being written into agricultural policy, which is a plus for some small and mid-sized farmers.
Small farms need local and supportive relationships to survive. But what else?
And we need more resources for people who may be interested in farming. That's an important piece as well. What are we doing in agricultural policy to help support, beginning farmers, people who may be interested in this profession? What's available to them?
So what can we all do to ensure a future in which small farming communities are protected, supported, and respected? Susan Nakakwa has one word of advice: agroecology.
Agroecology is the solution. Sustainable agricultural practices that think about the farmers, think about the climate, think about biodiversity, think about seed systems and food systems that have existed for time immemorial.
This involves letting local farmers devise farming solutions to suit their community's needs.
The future of farming should and must protect and celebrate smallholder farmers. And the future of food must embrace what the movement on the continent at the moment is talking about, which is agroecology. And it has been embraced across the world as well.
Kartini Simone agrees that handing the wheel to small farmers is the way forward.
So they are very, very effective, and they can produce better and more diversified food that we need. And so if we really want to sustain and to tackle all these problems with hunger and malnutrition around the world, is really there's a need to turning the control and resources back to the smallholder farmers, and in the same time to enact agricultural policies that support that.
This won't always be easy, but Veronica hopes the future of farming will have more room for the difficult conversations to be had, and for policy to address the inequities of the farming world through robust infrastructure and support.
I'm hoping 10 years in the future that we'll have more conversations about how agriculture is connected to our democratic principles. So I think agricultural policy has to make a space for small, mid-sized farmers to be able to sustain themselves. And I think building local food systems is a place that would be perfect for small and mid-sized farmers. They could provide, fresh fruit, vegetables, those people that eat, meat, poultry or whatever. But we got to have agricultural policy to reflect the building of that infrastructure. Small and mid-sized farmers cannot compete with big agricultural production. And so we've got to be mindful that there's room at the table for all types of farmers.
Making sure there is room at that table really depends upon all of us. It's up to you and me, the consumers, to decide where and how we want to support farmers, those who depend on the land, who work on it, who love it. The choices you make, how and what you eat, what you buy, or who you buy from. These are decisions that impact farming and farmers today, and will shape the future of farming tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on The Future of X, Future of Farming. This series is a partnership between Aussie Media and Vital Farms. It's written and hosted by me, Isabel Lee, writer at Aussie. It was produced by Cecily Meza-Martinez and Joshua Sui. Kate Paget also produced. Special thanks to Tracy Moran, Sean Braswell, and Simran Sethi. Special thanks to Phyllis Hughes, Hedda Borstrom, and Renata Lee for teaching me all there is to know about farming. Chris Hoff engineered our show. Make sure to subscribe to The Future of X, Future of Farming on the iHeartRadio app or listen wherever you get your podcasts.